The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floor. A well-dressed man in his early 40s stood quietly observing the bustling scene before him. His charcoal gray suit, though expensive, wasn't flashy, just perfectly fitted to his athletic frame. He'd chosen it carefully that morning, along with his burgundy tie, wanting to look professional but not attention-seeking on this particular day. As the newly appointed CEO of Skyline Airways, he had made an unusual decision: to fly as a regular passenger on his first day, booking a first-class ticket under his own name. No special treatment, no announcements, no executive welcome. He wanted to see his airline through the eyes of its customers. The boarding area at Gate S7 was already crowded with travelers, business people tapping away on laptops, families trying to keep their children entertained, and elderly couples sitting patiently with their carry-on bags. He smiled, remembering his first flight 20 years ago, sitting in economy class with nothing but big dreams and determination. His phone buzzed with messages from board members wishing him luck, but he left them unread. Today wasn't about boardroom handshakes or corporate speeches. It was about understanding the real heart of the airline he was about to lead. He watched the ground crew through the window, appreciating their coordinated movements as they prepared the aircraft. Standing in line, he could overhear snippets of conversations around him. A grandmother excited to meet her first grandchild, a young entrepreneur practicing his pitch, a couple heading to their honeymoon. These were the stories that filled every flight, the real people who trusted Skyline Airways with their precious cargo of hopes and dreams. He checked his boarding pass one more time. Seat 2A, first class. It wasn't about luxury, it was about experiencing every level of service his airline offered. In his carry-on briefcase, he carried a small notebook for observations. Old school, perhaps, but he believed in the power of handwritten notes. 20 years of climbing the corporate ladder had taught him that the smallest details often made the biggest difference. The gate area grew more crowded as boarding time approached. He noticed how people naturally sorted themselves into informal groups, the frequent flyers with their practiced efficiency, families gathering their scattered belongings, solo travelers absorbed in their phones or books. Every person had a story, a reason for their journey. As the first boarding call echoed through the terminal, he took a deep breath. This wasn't just another flight. It was the beginning of a new chapter, not only in his life, but in the history of Skyline Airways. What he didn't know was that this routine flight was about to become much more than a simple observation exercise. He stepped toward the priority boarding lane, ticket in hand, his mind already working on plans for improving the passenger experience. The gleaming corridor leading to the aircraft beckoned, promising new horizons. But sometimes the path to progress isn't as straight as an airport hallway, and lessons about change can come from the most unexpected moments. The boarding line moved forward, and with it, destiny took an interesting turn. Little did anyone know that this ordinary Thursday morning was about to become an extraordinary lesson in judgment, leadership, and the power of turning challenging moments into opportunities for positive change. The boarding line moved steadily forward as passengers showed their tickets and IDs. A flight attendant with perfectly styled blonde hair and a crisp uniform stood at the check-in counter, greeting each first-class passenger with a practiced smile. She'd been working this route for 15 years, and she prided herself on knowing exactly who belonged in first class. When the new CEO approached, her smile flickered for just a moment. Despite his impeccable suit and polished appearance, she immediately raised her hand to stop him. "Sir, I believe you're on the wrong line. General boarding is over there," she said, pointing to the longer line to the right. Her voice carried that particular tone that customer service professionals use when they think they've caught someone trying to get away with something. He calmly held out his ticket, his expression neutral but dignified. "I'm in the correct line," he said quietly, turning the first-class ticket so she could clearly see it. The flight attendant's eyebrows rose slightly as she took the ticket, holding it up to the light as if checking for watermarks. "This seems unusual," she muttered, tapping her finger on the counter. Around them, other first-class passengers, mostly older men in business suits, were being waved through with barely a glance at their tickets. A couple of them shot curious looks at the scene unfolding, but quickly looked away when they caught his eye. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" he asked, his voice remaining steady and professional. He'd faced situations like this before, but today was different. Today, he wasn't just any passenger being unfairly profiled. The flight attendant typed something into her computer, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "I'll need to verify this with my supervisor," she said, not making eye contact. "It's just that we have certain standards in first class." A younger flight attendant standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of how the situation looked. She took a half step forward, perhaps wanting to intervene, but stopped when her senior colleague shot her a warning glance. Time seemed to slow down as more passengers gathered behind them, creating a small crowd. The new CEO could feel their stares, hear their whispered conversations. He planned to remain anonymous on this flight, to quietly observe the airline's service from a passenger's perspective. But now he was becoming the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The board chairman's name flashed on the screen, perfect timing. He answered the call, speaking clearly but not loudly. "Yes, I'm just boarding now. My first official flight as CEO. I'm experiencing our check-in process firsthand." The flight attendant's face, which had been set in stern authority just moments before, suddenly went pale. Her hands froze over the keyboard as the meaning of his words sank in. The young flight attendant behind her brought her hand to her mouth, eyes widening in realization. The crowd that had gathered fell silent. Even the usual airport noise seemed to dim as the situation took an unexpected turn. This wasn't just about a boarding pass anymore. It was about assumptions, prejudice, and the moment when reality shatters preconceptions. The CEO ended his call and turned back to the flight attendant, who now looked like she wanted nothing more than to disappear into the airport's polished floor. He could have reacted with anger, could have demanded her immediate dismissal. Instead, he saw something more valuable, an opportunity for real change. The tension at Gate A7 had reached a breaking point. Other passengers watched the scene unfold, some recording with their phones, others whispering among themselves. The flight attendant's face had lost its previous confidence, replaced by a look of growing panic as she realized her massive mistake. I apologize for the confusion, sir," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. But the new CEO wasn't finished. He remained perfectly calm, his voice level and clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'd like to understand something," he said, placing both hands on the counter. "Before my phone rang, you were convinced my ticket needed special verification. Could you explain why?" The question hung in the air like heavy storm clouds. The flight attendant opened and closed her mouth several times, no words coming out. Her younger colleague stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation. "Sir, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. Please, let me escort you to your seat." "No," he said firmly but politely. "I think we need to address this moment. In fact, I'd like to speak with all the gate staff and flight crew before we take off." His words weren't angry, but they carried the unmistakable weight of authority. By now, a small crowd had gathered. An elderly woman in the priority line spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion. "I saw the whole thing. She didn't even look at his ticket properly before trying to send him to economy. I fly first class twice a month, and they never check my ticket that closely." The gate area buzzed with conversation. A businessman in line behind them was shaking his head, having witnessed everything. "This is exactly what's wrong with the system," he muttered to his colleague. "How many times have we seen this happen?" The supervisor, alerted by the commotion, rushed over from another gate. He took in the scene: the shocked flight attendant, the calm CEO, the crowd of onlooking passengers, and the phones recording everything. His face showed he knew this was far more than a simple boarding dispute. "Sir, I cannot apologize enough," the supervisor began, but the CEO raised his hand gently to stop him. "Save the apology for now," he said. "Instead, I want to turn this into something meaningful." He turned to address the growing crowd, his voice carrying naturally without having to shout. "I'm the new CEO of this airline, and this is my first day. I chose to fly as a regular passenger to understand our service firsthand. I didn't expect to get such a clear demonstration of what needs to change." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Some passengers nodded in approval, others looked embarrassed for the airline staff. The flight attendant seemed to shrink further into herself with each passing moment. "Here's what we're going to do," the CEO continued, drawing everyone's attention. This flight will be delayed by exactly 30 minutes. During that time, I'm going to have a conversation with our gate staff and flight crew. Not to punish anyone, but to start making real changes." He turned back to the flight attendant, whose eyes were now brimming with tears. "You're going to be part of this change," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Because sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've learned the hardest lessons." The passengers, rather than being annoyed by the delay announcement, began to applaud. Some were wiping tears from their eyes, others were nodding in approval. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about witnessing the moment when real change began. The private gate area normally used for flight crew briefings fell silent as the CEO walked in. About 20 people crowded into the small room: flight attendants, gate agents, and ground crew members. Their faces showed a mix of anxiety and uncertainty. The flight attendant from the check-in counter stood in the back, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Please, everyone take a seat," the CEO said, pulling up a chair for himself rather than standing at the front. This simple gesture changed the atmosphere from a disciplinary meeting to a conversation. What happened out there isn't just about one person or one moment. It's about patterns we need to break. He loosened his tie slightly and leaned forward. "I grew up in a small town," he began, his voice carrying easily in the quiet room. "My mother cleaned houses, and my father drove a delivery truck. They taught me that success comes from hard work, not from what you look like or where you come from." The room remained silent, but people began to lift their heads, really listening. "I've flown hundreds of times over my career. Been upgraded to first class because of my status, been bumped down when flights were overbooked. And yes, I've been questioned about belonging in certain spaces more times than I can count." A young gate agent in the front row wiped tears from her eyes. The supervisor who had rushed over during the incident shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "But today isn't about making anyone feel guilty," the CEO continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's about being honest with ourselves. How many times have we all made quick judgments about people based on how they look? How many times have we decided someone doesn't belong somewhere without knowing their story?" The flight attendant from the counter finally looked up, her face showing a mix of shame and understanding. An older ground crew member raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, I've worked here for 20 years. We've had training about this before, but this feels different." "Because it is different," the CEO responded, standing up now. "From this moment on, we're not just going to talk about change, we're going to live it. Every passenger who walks through our gates is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's hope for the future. They all have stories we don't know, dreams we can't see." He walked over to the flight attendant who had stopped him at the gate. "Your actions today weren't right," he said gently, "but they've given us all the chance to do better. Starting tomorrow, you'll work with our training department to develop a new program. Your experience will help others learn." The tension in her shoulders visibly released as she realized she wasn't being fired. Around the room, people began to nod, some even smiled. This wasn't the outcome anyone had expected. "We have exactly 15 minutes before our flight needs to board," the CEO concluded. "I want each of you to take a moment and think about one thing you'll do differently today. Not next week, not after more training, but today. Because change doesn't wait for tomorrow." As the room buzzed with quiet conversation, the CEO checked his phone. The board chairman had sent several messages, obviously having heard about the incident. But those messages could wait. Right now, in the small room at Gate 7, something more important was happening. Real change was taking root. When the passengers finally began boarding the plane, something had changed. The flight attendant who had caused the earlier scene now stood at the gate, checking tickets with a new awareness in her eyes. Each passenger received her full attention, regardless of their appearance or ticket class. The CEO watched from nearby, noticing how she made eye contact with everyone, offering genuine smiles instead of automatic ones. The other passengers could feel the difference too. An elderly man with a cane received extra attention without having to ask. A young mother struggling with 2 small children found herself surrounded by helpful staff members. The whole atmosphere had shifted from rigid routine to human connection. "Your seat is 2A, right this way," the flight attendant said to the CEO when it was his turn, her voice trembling slightly. But instead of moving past her, he paused. "Thank you," he said quietly. Real change starts with small moments like this. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly blinked them away, maintaining her professional composure. As passengers settled into their seats, conversations buzzed throughout the cabin. Those who had witnessed the earlier confrontation were sharing the story with others. A businessman in first class leaned across the aisle to speak with the CEO. "I've been flying this route for 15 years, he said, shaking his head in admiration. "Never seen anything handled quite like that. You could have fired her on the spot, made a big scene. But this was something different." The flight attendant moved through the cabin, performing her usual safety checks with a new sense of purpose. When she reached the CEO's seat, she paused longer than necessary, adjusting his seatbelt even though it was perfectly fine. "Sir," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I keep thinking about all the times I might have done this before. All the assumptions I made without even realizing it." The CEO looked up at her, noting the genuine regret in her eyes. "That's exactly why you're going to be valuable in changing things," he replied. "You understand now in a way that no training manual could teach." Other crew members watched their interaction, and you could see something clicking into place for them too. This wasn't just about one incident or one person, it was about recognizing patterns that had gone unnoticed for too long. As the plane prepared for takeoff, passengers were still talking about what they'd witnessed. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, turned around in her economy seat to wave at the CEO. Her mother tried to shush her, but he waved back with a warm smile. "Mommy," the girl said, loud enough for several rows to hear, "when I grow up, I want to be a boss like him. He made people better instead of mad." The simplicity of her observation cut through all the complexity of the situation. Several passengers nodded in agreement, and even the flight attendant, passing by with final checks, couldn't help but smile. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their departure. But everyone on that flight knew they weren't just heading to their destination, they were part of a journey towards something much more important. The flight landed smoothly 3 hours later, but its impact continued to ripple through the airline. By the time the CEO reached his office, the story had already spread through company channels. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from board members and executives, some concerned about public relations, others impressed by his handling of the situation. In the terminal, the flight attendant sat in the crew room, still processing the morning's events. Her colleagues gathered around, not to judge but to listen as she shared her story. "I didn't even realize I was doing it," she explained, her voice steady despite her emotions. "It was like looking in a mirror for the first time and seeing something you never noticed before." The CEO's first official action that afternoon wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of holding a press conference or issuing a corporate statement, he called a company-wide virtual meeting. Thousands of employees logged in from airports across the country, curious about their new leader. "Today, something happened that changed my plans for this airline," he began, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had shown at the gate. "I'd witnessed firsthand how our unconscious biases can affect our passengers, but I also saw the potential for real change." He shared the morning's events, not to shame anyone, but to illustrate a point. The flight attendant's story became a powerful teaching moment. "She could have lost her job," he continued. "Instead, she's going to help us become better." As he spoke, a new training program was already taking shape. The flight attendant who had stopped him would work directly with the human resources team, sharing her experience to help others recognize their own hidden biases. Her story would become a case study in how to turn a mistake into an opportunity for growth. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. Crew members began sharing their own stories, times they had made assumptions, moments they regretted, chances to do better that they had missed. What could have been a scandal became a movement within the company. The CEO received an unexpected email from a passenger who had been on that flight. It was the mother of the young girl who had wanted to be a boss like him. She attached a drawing her daughter had made, a colorful picture of an airplane with the words, "Everyone welcome," written in crayon across the top. He printed that picture and hung it in his office, right where every visitor could see it. When people asked about it, he would tell them, "This is our new company logo, drawn by our youngest corporate consultant." The flight attendant found herself in a new role, speaking to each incoming class of airline staff. She didn't hide her mistake or try to justify it. Instead, she used it to show others how to recognize their own biases and overcome them. "I thought I had lost everything that day," she would tell them. "Instead, I found a purpose I never knew I had." Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our most important work. 1 year later, the airline had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The story of that first-class confrontation had become part of the company's identity, not as a source of shame, but as a turning point. The CEO sat in his office, reviewing the year's progress reports, a smile playing on his lips. The numbers told an impressive story. Customer satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs, employee retention had improved dramatically, and the airline had become known as an industry leader in inclusive service. But it was the personal stories that really showed the change. A wall in the main training center displayed hundreds of thank you letters from passengers. "For the first time, I felt truly welcome on a flight," read one. "Your crew didn't just serve us, they saw us as people," said another. Each letter represented a small victory in the ongoing journey toward better service for everyone. The flight attendant who had sparked this transformation had just been promoted to head of customer experience training. Her personal story had touched thousands of employees, helping them recognize and overcome their own hidden biases. "We're not perfect," she often said in training sessions, "but we're perfectly committed to doing better every day." That morning, the CEO decided to take another flight, just like he had a year ago. This time, he watched as the same gate agent who had once tried to turn him away greeted each passenger with genuine warmth. She had become one of the airline's most valuable trainers, using her experience to help others learn. A young flight attendant approached him at the gate. "Sir," she said, "I just wanted you to know. I was in university when I read about what happened last year. It's why I chose to work here. I wanted to be part of an airline that wasn't afraid to face its mistakes and grow from them." As he settled into his seat, the CEO noticed something different about the safety cards in the pocket. They now featured people of all backgrounds, a small but significant change that showed everyone was welcome. The In-Flight magazine's cover story highlighted the airline's journey over the past year, titled "How One Moment Changed Everything." During the flight, he overheard a conversation between two passengers. "You know," one said to the other, "my grandmother used to be scared to fly because she never felt welcome. Now she says this is the only airline she trusts. Funny how things change." The CEO pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd carried that first day, and wrote down these words: "Change isn't about big announcements or fancy programs. It's about the small moments when people choose to see each other differently." As the plane soared through the clouds, he thought about that morning a year ago. What could have been a disaster had instead become a catalyst for real change. The airline hadn't just modified its policies, it had changed its heart. The little girl's crayon drawing still hung in his office, now framed alongside the company's new mission statement: "Everyone welcome, every flight, every day." It wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise they worked to keep with every passenger who stepped aboard.